Hello, my name is Sarah Bajan and I'm a lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Today I'll be sharing with you an initiative called Breaking the Binary, which aimed to change the traditionally taught ways of teaching sex and gender in an undergraduate science course in an Australian university. I would like to start with a welcome to country. The University of the Sunshine Coast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which its campuses sit. We recognise and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So as we know, the university student population is becoming increasingly diverse and therefore developing and delivering content that is accessible and relevant to every single student is becoming more and more important. This project came out of a faculty initiative whose purpose was to redress exclusionary practices that were present in an undergraduate science program. It was actually a student partner in this initiative that brought to our attention that course content perpetuated outdated notions of binarized sex and gender. As our student partner pointed out, minorities should not be alone in fighting against institutionalised discrimination and social ostracism, and therefore we used a student-staff partnership approach to address this harmful content. An example of stereotypical binarised genetics content that describes biological sex in humans can be seen in this figure here. The aim of this partnership was to reduce the difficulties faced by non-binary and transgender students who found their identities overlooked or pathologized by the content. Prescribed readings around the topic of sex and gender are often outdated and do not reflect current genetic understanding, and perhaps more importantly, does not place the content in a social or cultural context, which can therefore give the students the impression that science occurs in a cultural vacuum. Therefore, when developing inclusive material, we wanted the content to reflect contemporary discussion around the topics, to really stress the connection between scientific research and the society in which it takes place. We hope to maximise the relevance of the content with the partnership approach that included members with the appropriate disciplinary knowledge and those with relevant lived experience. And we found that this approach was a critically important aspect to the design and research process. The content that we focused on was genetics content presented in a core first-year undergraduate science subject. We reviewed the existing content and learning resources and started by removing problematic language and harmful descriptions. We then created a dedicated module that introduced the students to the concepts of biological sex, gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We hoped that this module would integrate inclusive representations of sex and gender, and we presented the relevant scientific research and grounded it in the learning objectives of genetic determination of biological sex. Content delivery for this course at the time was a traditional lecture, and therefore this 20-minute module was delivered in the same format. So here is a representative slide from the module, which is explaining a genetic mechanism that increases the diversity of biological sex in humans and is one cause of intersex individuals. So prior to this module, biological sex and gender were taught as binary concepts, and these separate concepts were often confused and conflated in the language used in the learning resources. The module that we created aimed to represent these concepts, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, as distinct spectra, as summarized in the figure here. So we also plan to evaluate the success of the module, and therefore we sought to answer these questions. What were the student attitudes to the module, and what concepts did the students understand or not understand? And if the attitudes or the understanding differ by student gender or their minority status. Multiple data sources were used to triangulate student learning. So we evaluated this via an in-class quiz, and the student responses underwent thematic analysis to reveal which content was well understood and which content had caused confusion within the cohort. The quiz grade was then compared to the overall subject grade. These quiz answers were then compared to the student's self-reported confidence in the module concepts via a questionnaire which asked what concepts the students had retained and could explain. Thematic analysis of the quiz answers identified areas of student understanding and misconceptions. However, overall, the majority of students understood the core concepts of the module. An example of a misconception we found is when the student mixed up gender identity with gender expression. An indicative quote pulled from a student quiz answer is gender identity is defined by society and their views, which is incorrect, as gender identity is the gender that you as an individual identify as. And we found 53 counts where this misconception had occurred. In the questionnaire, students reported their self-perceived confidence in their learning and were asked to identify the concepts they had learned. These responses were coded and categorized into 8 themes. Here again is a representative example where the theme was that the student could identify that biological sex and gender were different concepts. And again, an indicative quote pulled from the questionnaire was that there is a distinct difference between sex and gender, and they are both complex and multifaceted topics. And there were 41 counts of this understanding by the student. So what we could conclude from analysing the quiz answers and the questionnaire answers was that the most well understood concept from the module was that biological sex is not fixed and can change over a lifetime, whereas the least well understood concept was gender identity. When we looked at the module quiz answers compared to the student's final mark of the overall subject, we found that there was a small to medium correlation, but that the average quiz marks were significantly higher than the overall subject mark, which does align with the thematic analysis of the quiz answers, indicating that students understood the content more commonly than not. Further analysis revealed that there was no difference in the quiz marks between student gender or if they were a domestic or international student. To evaluate student attitudes towards the module, we asked them to voluntarily complete an anonymous online questionnaire using Likert scale and open response questions. The survey included questions about the student perceived understanding of the concepts of the module, the perceived usefulness of these concepts, and the desire for similar content to be included in other courses within the programme. We also collected some demographic information from the participants, such as their minority status. Here's a summary of the closed response items of the questionnaire. We use factor analysis to calculate and average the participant response. A higher score, so that means that the bar extends more towards the right-hand side of the slide, indicates a more positive attitude towards the module. What we consistently found that when broken down by minority status, the students who self-identified as a minority, so they're indicated by the grey bar on this graph, have a more positive attitude towards the module when compared with the entire cohort, which is the black bar on the graph. Looking at the open response questions, the majority of feedback from the students we received was positive and highlights the perceived importance of the content and appreciation of the scientific basis for the presentation. However, we did receive a few negative responses that voiced these students did not believe the content was appropriate in a science subject, or they disagreed with the content itself. Our evaluation of the module did indicate that we did begin to redress some of the exclusionary practices that were present in the subject. Our main findings were that minority students have the most positive attitude towards the module, and we would argue that this represents compensatory effects, which means that while all students did benefit from learning more about these topics, for students from minority groups this felt particularly relevant and contributed to a better understanding of themselves and potentially leading to an increased sense of belonging within their degree. We found that linking the content to genetic concepts and mechanisms for appropriate contextualization of the content helped to emphasize its relevance to the students. The staff-student partnership and the role of allies we found was critical to the success of this project, as we could share that burden of risk-taking that all too often falls on people that have to advocate in isolation. We have also identified some limitations to this module in its first iteration, and the first is depicting different concepts as spectra. So while these spectra are a visually useful way to depict fluidity within those concepts, they do have distinct endpoints, which may unintentionally reinforce the binaries we are trying to move away from. Secondly, this module was delivered in a traditional lecture format to fit in with the rest of the subject. However, we know that active learning and structured reflection is a better way to facilitate learning potentially challenging content. And finally, The scientific contextualization of the concepts was not consistent, which was actually picked up by the students, as the topics discussed with the less scientific approach were less frequently identified as a key concept of the module. Lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge everyone who worked on this project. So a very big thanks to Lucy Mercer-Mapston, who really was the driving force behind this project and the person who created the initiative in the first place. Kasia analysed the student responses to the questionnaire. Christine is the coordinator of the subject which we delivered the module into, and Arthur is our student partner. The module was created and delivered at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I'd like to thank the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion who provided funding for the project. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present this project and for listening.